Okay, well, anyway, hello, folks. My name is Morgan Patelka. I am a professor of history here at UNC Chapel Hill, and I am lucky to get to work with a group of graduate students, undergrads, and one local high school student in the UNC Japanese History Lab, which we have just started up this year for the first time. And today we're going to talk about some of the research that we're doing, some of the professional and career development opportunities that we have in the lab. And we have some presentations by students who are going to be here in the meeting, but also a couple of short pre-recorded presentations. Some of the students couldn't make this time because of other class obligations, so I'll be playing those as well. But first, I just wanted to say that I am a historian of pre-modern Japan. My specialty is the study of the medieval and the early modern period. And I work on topics that are very distant from the place and the time that we live in today. I work on the history of the samurai and the history of the tea ceremony and the history of late medieval and early modern cities. My main interest is what's called material culture, the study of things. But although those seem, I think, like esoteric and kind of distant topics, part of what for me is meaningful about the study of history, of course, is the many ways in which the past informs the present and in which the problems that we look at from moments of continuity and moments of transition in the history of a place like Japan actually can help us to understand and make our way through the world better today. That's true whether we're looking at culture or politics, or increasingly my interest has moved more and more to the study of the environment. And so issues like climate change, issues related to public health and the environment are not only direly important in this moment that we're all living in, but are found sprinkled throughout the historical record and are part of what I like to research, to write about, and to teach. So today we're going to hear from a couple different students, and I'm hoping I can ask Sophie to go first. I will put this up.
Cool. I'm Sophie Eichelberger. I'm a first-year master's student in the Department of Middle Eastern and Asian Studies.
Can you see that?
Yeah, and so, yes.
Awesome.
My interest is in kimono. I'm working on a paper that's about how kimono is worn and photographed. And so I'm looking at two different sources. I have some kimono fashion magazines. The one I've included here is from the spring 2017. That my Japanese professor actually gave me. And so I'm looking at how kimono is photographed there, how it relates to the bodies that it's on, how the background affects how it adds or detracts to the value of the kimono. For example, the bottom picture there is a woman posed in front of flower arrangements. And flower arrangement, or ikebana, is a very traditional Japanese art that women will participate in. So what does it mean that this woman in kimono is posed in front of flower arrangements? And I'm also interested in the text that accompanies these images. For example, in this magazine, there's one about what the traditional patterns of kimono mean. And so how does that add to the images that are accompanied throughout the magazine? What bodies are the kimono on? For example, this cover is a very beautiful woman, but she's very traditionally Japanese. I hesitate to say that, but she has very soft makeup on. Her hair is pulled back. It's not bleached or colored in any way. She doesn't have any nail polish on, any jewelry that you can see. So how does the styling add to the meaning of the kimono? So that's in the magazines. And then I'm also interested comparing kimono in these magazines versus Instagram influencers. Street style, streetwear, how are these young people changing what it means to wear a kimono? And so I kind of argue that they're subverting these traditional archetypes of Japanese femininity by changing the poses, how you wear, how you stand in kimono, how you style it. I don't know if you can tell, but one woman is wearing it backwards. They're mixing it with these other elements, for example, corsets instead of an obi, or one woman is wearing jeans under a cropped kimono. What kind of kimonos these are, a lot of them tend to be vintage instead of these really expensive kimonos that you find in the fashion magazines, and how they're self-styling themselves with bold makeup, crazy hair, and how it's changing what it means to wear kimono. And this is a question that interests me because I'm just interested in fashion generally, but then kimono and other ethnic wear is often comes up in the media. It's like cultural appropriation, who gets to wear kimono, I guess, but it's also just how, outside of questions of cultural appropriation, how are Japanese people themselves changing what it means to wear kimono and how you can wear kimono, are all the kind of questions that I'm interested in.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sophie.
All right.
And please introduce yourself as well, Jack.
Yes. Hello, I'm Jack. I'm from the NC School of Science and Math, which is a high school in Durham that's part of the UNC system. And as part of my school's senior research and mentorship program, I've been lucky enough to be able to work here at UNC in the Japanese history lab. And I would want to share a little bit about what I've been researching, which is the early modern periods, and specifically the foreign relations of the early modern period. So the government that ruled Japan during the early modern period is the Tokugawa shogunate, ruled from about 1600 to 1868. And what's interesting about its foreign policy is that it had different relations with different countries, depending on personal national interests and the standings of those different countries. And it could often vary wildly. You see on that diagram on the right is a little bit of a condensed version, but one of the most notable and well-known aspects of Tokugawa diplomacy is the so-called sakoku, or closed country policy, which meant there was absolutely no trade or contact allowed with the European nations, excepting the Netherlands, who were allowed to trade in one port, Nagasaki. This was because the European nations and Christianity was seen as a threat. So the government wanted to maintain stability and national peace. And another relationship that was reflected by this desire for stability is the relationship with China, which was non-existent in diplomatic terms. Although there was some trade, there was no official diplomacy between Japan and China, because Japan did not want to be subservient to China, as it would be a compromise of the legitimacy of the government. One other notable thing about Tokugawa diplomacy that's interesting is that local lords, such as the one I have pictured right here, So Yoshinari, who was the Lord of Tsushima, played an important role. Specifically for Tsushima, was the domain in charge of handling relationships with Korea. So the conflict between local lords and the central government actually could be important to determining diplomatic policy in the Tokugawa era, and it often led to some strange or controversial affairs in the realm of diplomacy. And why I think this research is relevant is because it looks at the subject of isolationism and openness when it comes to diplomatic and trade relations, which is not only relevant in modern Northeast Asia, where you see countries like China and the Koreas dealing with these issues, but it's relevant here in America, where we are still debating topics like immigration, foreign trade, and diplomatic relations with other countries, where it's not a solved question. It's still quite discussed in our modern times. And I personally wish to further explore this relationship I touched on about between the central government, the shogunate, and the local lords in matters of foreign policy, because it's interesting to see how personal interest could affect the diplomacy and the foreign policy of the nation as a whole. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to turn to my own research then and add on the videos of my other students' work to the end. Can you see the Rebirth of Kyoto screen, Sophie? Can you hear me? Okay, good. All right. Well, I apologize, everyone, for my technical difficulties. I'll keep working on that. So a project that I'm trying to bring everyone into in the lab is my new research on the history of Kyoto. There's a lot of really interesting scholarship about Kyoto as a pre-modern capital that already is available out there in the world, that focuses on the built environment and the culture of the city. But what I hope to do for the first time in any language is write an environmental history of Kyoto that takes into account the location of the city in the basin known as the Yamashiro Basin, which you see here in these two maps of the city, and its proximity to the Eastern Hills and Lake Biwa and these other important geographical and geological features that really make Kyoto what it is, but have never been considered as part of the history of the city. One of the most famous politicians in the history of Kyoto is the warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who I and some of my students have worked on. And one thing that is not well known is that he built a giant wall around the city of Kyoto. Speaking of borders and boundaries and the control of trade, a la Jack, Hideyoshi constructed this wall called the Odoi, which I'm calling the Hegemon's Wall, to shield Kyoto from potential attacks in the 1590s. And this really had a transformative environmental and cultural effect on the city. Even today, we talk about inside the city and outside the city in Japanese, rakuchu, rakugai. That refers to being on one side or the other of this wall. Only remnants survive today. It was a huge earthen wall with a canal built on the outside, and it was covered in a bamboo forest that helped to keep the wall intact. So there are really interesting ramifications in terms of the forestry of the city. This was part of a much larger attempt to completely rebuild Kyoto and control its residents. So for example, the Buddhist temples of the city, many of them were relocated to a single district so that the warlord Hideyoshi could keep an eye on them and prevent them from moving against him either religiously or politically. Another moment in the history of Kyoto's environmental side that I'm looking at is the early 17th century creation of the canals through the city by the merchant Suminokura Ryoi. He's well known to us today as a tea practitioner, but he also ran a business transporting goods in and out of the city by river. And so he wanted more and better canals laced throughout the city. Today, these canals are beautiful places you can go to look for maiko or see the cherry blossoms, but they are there because of their role in shipping. And this also is part of the changing built and environmental landscape of Kyoto. Another figure I'm profiling in my research is Kobori Enshu, who's a very famous garden designer and construction magnate who also was a tea master. And Enshu designed many of the really important buildings and gardens of Kyoto. He worked on the Imperial Palace and the Emperor's Gardens. And he worked on gardens associated with Shugakuin, the imperial villa just outside of the city. So when we think of the traditional landscape of these gardens, I think we imagine a kind of timeless natural state, but these are in fact artificial sites that were built and that had environmental consequences. The most sort of striking geographical feature of Kyoto is the Kamogawa, the Kamo River that goes right through the middle of the city. And it was prone to flooding in the late 16th and early 17th century. And there was a huge project to reinforce the riverbanks in the mid 17th century called the Kanbun Shinte that I'm going to look at, where these giant stone blocks that look like they should have been the foundation for a castle were brought in to provide a sturdy and reliable flood protection that would allow the mercantile districts to thrive. So a lot of the environmental changes were also about stimulating commerce. One of the reasons this was necessary is that Japan was being affected by what's called the Little Ice Age of the 16th and 17th centuries, which led to more flooding than usual in Kyoto. And I want to connect this to things happening in Europe and other parts of the world in this same period. Part of the point of doing an environmental history of Kyoto is to get away from the idea that Japan is completely isolated out in the middle of the ocean. And I want to look at the forests and the plants, the flora of Kyoto in this period, and see how they're imported from other countries and how they're interconnected to the local environment and the pre-existing flora and fauna of the Yamashiro Basin. Many of the famous flowers and trees that we now associate with Kyoto are not local. They're brought from other parts of the country or the world. So camellia flowers, for example, were beloved by the shogun and the emperor and were imported into the city. The last part of the book will look at the animal life of the city, everything from horses to hawks, and try to understand what role the non-human actors of Kyoto played in the re-landscaping of Kyoto in the 17th century. Finally, I'll have an epilogue that looks at environmental disasters that have unfolded in Kyoto after the 17th century, including events like the devastating 1934 typhoon that really laid waste to the city of Kyoto, and try to understand how the environmental history of those earlier centuries is related to the later flooding, typhoon, and earthquake-related disasters that have continued to complicate the lives of Kyoto's residents. This is a project that is very much dependent on the conversations I'm having in the lab and the research assistance that I get from the members in the lab. And I hope it will allow us to reimagine the city as not being just a product of human culture, the imperial capital, the old imperial capital of Japan, but a kind of codependent urban agglomeration that is the result both of natural and environmental factors as well as human factors. Or maybe we just imagine that those two things are not separate forces at all. Let's see. Finally, I wanted to mention a few of the professional development opportunities that we've been working on in the lab. In the summer, we had a really exciting chance to work with an animation studio based in London. This is a organization called Cave Academy that teaches animation skills. And we partnered with them on a project they were doing that was set in 19th century Japan. It's a kind of short film, a short animated film that was an exercise in certain animation skills for the students in the academy, but they wanted to take seriously issues of representation and historical realism. And we were able to provide them with feedback about some of the imagery and some of the settings so that they could approach what was a fun and fantastical project in many ways with the usual characters, ninjas and samurai and demons, but with an attention to historical detail that might not have been possible without the input from the students in the lab. That was a great experience. This semester, we have a new collaboration that's just starting up with the Ackland Art Museum here on campus. Those of you who are at UNC know that the Ackland Art Museum is one of the best museums in this part of the country. You might not know that it really does have the best collection of Japanese art in the Southeast. And that gives us a wonderful opportunity to collaborate with them on some new displays that are going to be going up in the spring as part of a new exhibition. They have two projects. One is a display of modern Japanese ceramics. And so Sophie and hopefully other members of the lab will be providing some input to what kinds of labels, what kinds of didactic materials would work best. There's a very specialized terminology that goes along with Japanese ceramics. And when needed, all the students in the lab are at various stages of studying Japanese. They can help to do research into the context for exhibiting ceramics in Japan and how that should affect the Ackland's displays. And then another project is related to a new collection of modern prints, ukiyo-e or woodblock prints that the Ackland acquired, mostly from the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912, including a number of prints associated with the Satsuma Rebellion. And Megan McClory, who's a PhD student in history, will be working on that project and providing input into what prints might be displayed, and again, what kinds of interpretations and labels would work best. So the students who are working with me are studying Japanese history. Some of them are doing their BA in history or Japanese. Some of them are doing the MA in Asian and Middle Eastern studies. Some of them are doing the PhD in Asian history. And of course, all of them are receiving training that will help them to go on with their studies in academia if that's the path they choose. But many students who work on global topics like the study of Japan or who study history go into other fields as well. So these are projects that are attempts to give students training in soft skills and hard skills in other industries so that other career paths can be opened up, other than just going on to grad school and going on into academia, which isn't always, of course, what students want to do or even feasible with academic job markets being what they are.
Hi, my name is Bianca Garcia. I'm a third-year student at UNC. I'm majoring in medical anthropology with a minor in chemistry. I am on the pre-pharmacy track, but I was interested in doing research in medical anthropology, and I just recently started working with Professor Patelka. So just my personal interest right now has been medical anthropology, but in the relation to the development of pharmaceuticals. So how different cultures have related to the development of pharmaceutical companies today and just the impact that they've had. So the goals for the research that I'm doing right now is preliminary going to be an annotated bibliography on the medical history of Japan. So currently we're just reading through different books that are available in English that have information on different diseases and the treatments. So I listed one on the slide and it's called Kingdom of the Sick. It's just a really interesting book about leprosy in Japan and the social effects and development of different medicines and ways of treatment. And just the relevance for today, there's a lot of Japanese-owned pharmaceutical companies in North Carolina, and I also listed one of those on this slide. So there's one in Raleigh that's been around for a few years, and it's actually one of the largest pharmaceutical companies for different generics. So it just shows that Japanese pharmaceutical companies play a major role in just like the entire industry, which is why it's important to consider the history of the development of those. And just the last bullet point, that they're responsible for many medical advancements. So even in the book that I'm currently working on, The Kingdom of the Sick, it talks about how there was research done in Japan relating to like natural remedies for leprosy and different evolution of medicine in Japan. But that's it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Thomas Curtis. I am a senior at UNC Chapel Hill working on a major in both the Japanese language and history. My focus in history is Japanese history, although I'm part of the African, Asian, and Middle Eastern concentration. In the spring, I completed a senior honors thesis about the historical general from 12th century Japan, Minamoto no Yoshitsune. He was a member of the Minamoto clan that was descended from the emperor and was a major samurai clan at the time. The Genpei War, of which he was one of the primary generals on the Minamoto side, was fought between the Minamoto clan and the Taira clan over hegemony of the Japanese territories, essentially sidelining the emperor in favor of a warrior government, which ended up being led by the Minamoto leader, Minamoto no Yoritomo, who was Yoshitsune's half-brother. Yoshitsune is an incredibly popular and incredibly powerful character in Japanese literature and folklore. And in the almost 1,000 years since his life, a multitude of stories have been conjured and developed around who he was, his personality, his various traits, his life itself, and all of them differ as time goes on in respect to how they represent the samurai and how that represents the way in which the samurai were perceived by the general people of Japan. The earliest stories about Yoshitsune came in the form of recitative works that traveling blind monks would recite to large audiences of commoners with the accompaniment of music. And they generally focused primarily on the taira, the losing side in the Genpei War, although Yoshitsune was obviously mentioned somewhat often as one of the opposing generals. These were based off of a government document in small part called the Azuma Kagami, and also on as much living memory as was possible at the time. And the living memory and the government document generally portrayed Yoshitsune as you might expect a government document to portray a historical figure. He's very human. He's described as somewhat short. He's imperfect. He can be a little bit hot-headed. He's generally loyal, but he has times where he clashes with his retainers, and it's all very human. But as soon as we get to this recitative work, we see that the focus has shifted a little bit off of history and historical fact towards kind of a literary narrative in which Yoshitsune is portrayed much more as like a perfect general almost. He takes risks and, you know, has these gambits that always pay off in some of the most spectacular ways possible. There's one story where he took his force up onto a mountain so that they could do a cavalry charge down the mountain into a fort, which is ridiculous, but also really cool. So it's already some sort of shift away from possibly historically accurate to, well, it's still possible that that did happen, but it's a lot more like a modern action movie, something that is appealing to the masses. As we shift away from the Kamakura shogunate to the brief imperial restoration and the Ashikaga shogunate, the theater of No began to develop really to its height. And Yoshitsune's stories, little folkloric tales about Yoshitsune, began to be set on the No stage. And the reason this happened was because No comes from a very commoner practice, and therefore the writers of these stories knew that their audiences would be primarily samurai, but there would be a lot of commoners involved. So they took these stories of Yoshitsune that had been preserved in the consciousness of the commoners of middle Japan around the area between Kyoto and Tokyo. And they formatted them for the theater. And this tended to focus a lot less on his role in the war as a general and a lot more on his early life, particularly at Kurama Temple, where he learned how to fight and learned about what had happened to his parents, to his clan, and his like rage against the Taira was really developed. And later in life, when he is fleeing from his half-brother after being accused of treason. These are certainly more the popular consciousness kind of the tragedy and the tragic hero fleeing to his death sort of stories. These were appealing to the samurai because in many of the stories, Yoshitsune has very loyal retainers, and that kind of reinforces the power hierarchy of the Ashikaga shogunate. But at the same time, Yoshitsune is identified with very strongly by the commoners as someone who is being wronged by the government that he serves. And so it's kind of this dual sort of pincer movement where both the samurai and the commoners can identify with this one historical figure who lived a couple hundred years ago at this point. And I argue in my thesis that this creates a proto-national bond, something that people in Japan can see as Japanese and see as linking them together. So as we go further on, we get a book that has all of these Noh plays put together into one sort of cohesive story, I suppose, from Yoshitsune's birth to his death. This almost skips his role historically entirely. It reduces the Genpei War, the war that made him an important figure. It reduces that to 2 sentences in the entire book and focuses primarily on his early life at Kurama Temple and his later life on the run. And then we get into the Edo period, where kabuki, the now traditional form of Japanese theater, began to be developed and propagated among the masses, which further placed the story of Yoshitsune within the power of the common people, and therefore began to reflect the plight of commoners as well. This, I argue, further entrenches these proto-national bonds and even creates this idea, it contributes to the development of the idea of Bushido. All of these, amazing traits that Yoshitsune possesses, loyalty, martial skill, general, like, strategic brilliance, all of that is kind of attributed to samurai, not just like the Japanese as a whole, but specifically the samurai. And these are all sort of facets of Bushido as it becomes developed in the early 20th century. And even now, in the modern day, Yoshitsune appears in pop culture like manga and anime, and all of these different forms of expression of this historical figure. He's in one, he might be a protagonist, highly martial skilled, kind of quintessential samurai as we see them today. And in others, he could be an antagonist, kind of playing with his role. In others, he's a woman, he's with reverse to gender roles kind of thing. And it's kind of playing with this historical national figure. It's almost a folk hero to kind of explore what it means to be Japanese. And I think that this is particularly relevant because historical and literary figures often become used as a kind of focal point for national sort of community or expression. Things like the story of Robin Hood in England, or the various folk heroes of America, they become focal points, things that we point to and say, that's part of my culture, my society. And Yoshitsune fulfills that same role in Japan. And his story is even now used in the form of pop culture to sort of propagate cultural nationalism. And I think that it's very important for us to understand the ways in which these figures, these larger than life historical, literary folk heroes, influence the ways we think about our own cultures, our own societies, our own nations, and kind of think about how we can begin to understand them not as solely British, solely Japanese, solely American, but as part of a larger world history. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Megan McClory. I am a second-year graduate student in the history department, and I study pre-modern Japanese history, primarily military and social history. I've been working a lot on Toyotomi Hideyoshi and his peace policies that ended about 100 years of civil war back in the 1600s. And so today I'm going to talk about those peace policies and particularly what it means during peacetime for people not to have swords. Sounds a little bit odd, but here we go. So for these peace policies, they were mostly implemented by Toyotomi Hideyoshi at the end of the 16th century. Their continuation of Oda Nobunaga, who is officially the first unifier who began ending the Sengoku era, the Warring States period. But these peace policies primarily were castle breaking, land surveys, and sword hunts. Castle breaking comes across pretty obvious. Destroying castles obviously limits your military capabilities. It also destroys trade, it has economic retaliations, and also affects kind of like a cultural symbol. It's like people of status had a castle. That's true basically anywhere in the world. And so getting rid of that also kind of gets rid of that symbolism and that status symbol. So that was a big part of the first case policy. Then there's also land surveys, cadastral land surveys, which is probably one of the most impactful peace policies. Basically, the shogun, the military lords, got really into taking notes on people and having numbers and facts about like the population and where people lived, because that way he could have control of taxes. And by assigning people to like different pieces of land, it kind of reduced their mobility, which also meant that they couldn't, shift their alliances. They were completely dependent on their bit of land. And so just like, there wasn't much room for the peasants to maneuver if they were tied to the lands and if they're totally dependent on the way that these tax structures were built. And so that was the land surveys, the main purpose of those. And finally, there's the sword hunts, which is arguably the most interesting because swords. But the idea is really what it sounds like. It was a total disarmament of everybody but the samurai class. So it took away all the swords, the guns, anything with a blade longer than a forearm, or anything that could kill people from the peasant class, and made it the sole responsibility of the samurai to be involved in warfare. And I got really interested in this because that would not fly in the US, would it? And the idea of this was basically to solidify the class structure. So peasants are stuck as peasants and samurai are samurai. There's no room to maneuver before that. Peasants can't become samurai and people can't move up in the social ladder. And of course, this also had military meaning as well. There are less people to be in the army. Most of the armies during the Sengoku period, during the Warring States period, were made up of just locals, peasants who would pick up a spear or a sword and fight for the local lord. And of course, if they didn't have their own spear or sword, this would be a lot more difficult. And the effects of this are primarily what I was interested in, because peasant protests still happen. Peasant protests have been a thing in Japan for ever, basically. And so they took different forms. Some of them were violent, some of them were just like petitions. But the key thing to note is that they continued into what's known as the Pax Tokugawa, this period of 200 plus years of total peace. As you can see on this chart over here, it actually increased as time went on. So there was some periods where it's actually fairly peaceful, but people were still making their voices heard in kind of these peasant uprisings. And this brings into the question, how peaceful was the Pax Tokugawa in reality? And if it was limited to the upper classes, because it's true that the Civil War basically ended. There was no competition towards the shogun anymore. And the daimyo didn't fight with each other. It's mostly just these peasants against the samurai, or vice versa, in the case maybe in Satsuma Rebellion. And so it's interesting to look at what the effects of these peace policies actually were, and what Pax Tokugawa actually means in the end. So thank you for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed studying Japanese history. Hope to have more.
All right. Well, thank you for listening. I hope those presentations and comments from the different students who I'm so lucky to work with here in the Japanese History Lab have been helpful. If you have any questions or if you want to learn more, please take a look at our website, which is japanese-history.unc.edu. And thanks for your interest. Take care.